Welcome, I'm Rose Martin, and we are right around the corner in Roanoke with Pulitzer Prize winner and investigative journalist Mary Carter Bishop. Her book tells a story of a long-held family secret and what she went through over a decade to find those pieces and put it all together. The book, Don't You Ever, My Mother and Her Secret Son, is part heartbreaking and yet tells such a truth, and I can't wait to chat with her about it. Mary, welcome to Right Around the Corner.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, and your book, I have to say, was one of those ones, and obviously I need to jump in though, Sparkle. We've got a guest with us. Your beautiful puppy Sparkle is here with us.
Hey, Sparkle.
So putting your book together, you said, took about 10 years, but before we get there, you grew up in one of the most beautiful parts of our region, but it wasn't always easy.
That's right. I grew up in Keswick, which is in Albemarle County, east of Charlottesville. It's a set of old plantations, and very, very wealthy people live there. My parents were servants on one of those old estates. So it was a very odd way to grow up. I didn't realize until later what an unusual place it was. I mean, I played dress up with my boss lady's cast off black satin cocktail hat. And I guess I thought every little girl had that. But there was a tremendous gap in assets there. You were either pretty much rich or poor, with very few people in between.
How long did you stay there?
My parents were there for 40 years. And you know, I moved away, but I kept coming back.
Outside of playing dress up, what was it like for you as a young reader and a young writer?
You know, my father was a lover of language, and my folks didn't finish high school, but they loved to read, and they loved current events. So right away, I became very interested in the written word, and I was rewarded by my teachers for my writing when I was a little girl. So that's kind of where it all started.
And you were the golden girl, right?
Oh, I was.
Okay, what is it like to be a golden girl growing up on an estate like that with your family? We
were fairly poor, but my parents invested everything they had in me. So I grew up actually very privileged. I was like a little princess, very spoiled.
Were there other children to play with?
There were no children to play with, but there was a boy on the perimeter of our home. I would see him occasionally. They said he was my cousin.
And he turns out to be a lot more.
Yes.
So let's chat about your mom. She, growing up, wanted so much for herself, but yet lived kind of a sheltered upbringing too, correct?
Yes. She grew up in Manita in Bedford County, which was then, you know, a very humble farming community, not the big lake resort that it is now. And her father worked on a farm of more affluent people, and very strict. You know, no card playing, no dancing, no makeup, all of that. So she grew up and her mother had died when she was 4 years old, right in front of her in a buggy accident.
What a tough thing to have to deal with. I know when I read that in your book, that how could that not impact you or your decisions or the way you view life?
Yes.
Experiencing something like that.
My mother's startle response was set on high forever after, because she saw her world change so dramatically right there in a second.
So then she becomes a teenager and decides to spread her wings a little bit.
Yes, and she had quite a fraught relationship with her stepmother. Stepmother was strict. My mom was always kind of defying her, and so that went on for quite a few years.
But always close to her dad?
Yeah, she was always close to her father.
Well, even growing up in what it sounds like in a loving home, she experienced not only watching the death of her mother, but she was actually, you know, a victim of a sexual assault.
Yes. When she was 18, her stepmother sent her to stay over the Christmas holidays with the stepmother's cousin in Covington in Allegheny County. And there my mother was finally free, and there was a man there who gave her her first beer and led her to an outbuilding behind the woman's house. And she had her first sex, and she went home thinking everything was fine, but it wasn't. Within a couple of months, she was clearly pregnant, and the whole community didn't really know what to do with her. They had to get her out because they didn't want her to set an example for other young girls. They didn't want anybody else getting pregnant unmarried. It was just the worst possible thing.
Stigma and shame.
It was. And that attached to her right then. And one of the members of her church sent her to the Florence Crittenden home in Lynchburg. And that's where she had my brother Ronnie.
And then from the home, she was able to stay there for a year and raise the baby on her own?
Yes, and they bonded in that year. She had mothering classes and nursing classes, and they spent a lot of time together, and there are beautiful pictures that she took of him.
So initially, that bond that you talk about was a mother-child bond that she thought she and Ronnie would be together and she would raise him.
Yeah, she thought that.
But it didn't work out that way when she had to go to work.
Right. So she came to Roanoke to be a nurse or a cleaning woman. And at first she cleaned houses. But what was she going to do with him? There was no child care. There was really no support system for single mothers at that time. And she didn't have family in Roanoke. So eventually she got into trouble. She took him to one of her boss's houses where she was cleaning or something, and she clothespinned him, his diaper, not him, to the bed so he wouldn't roll off. And of course he screamed, and pretty soon somebody came and saw this distressed child, and they told social services about her. And that's when he went to a foster family.
And that foster family, Polly and Roy, turned out to be really surrogate parents that loved him dearly, didn't they?
They did. They did. He went to them when he was 16 months old. And so he thought that they were his birth parents. And they loved him very much. They gave him voice lessons even, and piano lessons, and all kinds of toys. And he had a wonderful time with them. And they were part of an extended family, so he spent a lot of time on the foster mother's parents' farm near Blacksburg.
But what seems like it might have been an idyllic resolution or a solution to a young single mom with a baby and an adoring couple who wanted to adopt him, things took a turn, and your mom didn't let that happen.
No, and I don't really know, and I asked her late in life why she wouldn't let them adopt him because she was very fond of them and respected them and thought they were good for her boy. But I think she wanted to show the folks back in Manita that she could be a good mother to him. And she was hoping to marry soon, and then she would have a home for him perhaps, and she would show them that Overstreet girl, that was her maiden name, that she did okay eventually.
So still that idea of social acceptance, right, with the haves and the have-nots, the social acceptance with the stigma and the shame, that despite what's happened, I want to make this right. I want to change what's happening and have people think that, yeah, she did okay.
But eventually, Polly and Roy said, we've waited long enough. We've been asking you for years to let us adopt him. And so you have to take him now. We're giving him up. Just terrified her. She had no place for him. She was by then nursemaid for a wealthy family and living in the servants' quarters at their place. So she put him in the Boys' Home Orphanage, an Episcopal orphanage near Covington, ironically near where he was conceived.
Well, let's leave Ronnie there for right now. We'll come back to him in a second. So you're growing up and you're on your way to college. And you are, you know, this young girl who just has the world at her fingertips.
Yes, I did. And I had been actually, had been a newspaper reporter for a while, and I was going to Europe.
And you actually started out with obituaries, right? Starting out writing obituaries.
I did. I started out with obituaries and then moved up to little feature stories, and eventually I wrote about religion, because in those days women were not allowed. A lot of newspapers didn't allow women, didn't think women should be covering things like politics and crime because we were too fragile, thought, for that.
So I bet that was interesting. So you were writing about the local churches or the stories that were affiliated with some of the local congregations?
Yes, yes. And those turned out to be very newsworthy, because this was in the 60s, and at that time organized religion was very fascinated with social change and women's rights and civil rights, and so all of a sudden my stories were getting on the front page.
So you really kind of cut your teeth right there with those, and that sparked that investigative yearning that then you knew this was what I need to do, and I'm going to dig into these stories and find the truth wherever it goes.
Yes, yes. And by the 70s, Woodward and Bernstein, their series, their reporting on Richard Nixon was making investigative journalism so important in America. So that's kind of the track I took when I went to graduate school in journalism.
Do you remember your first big investigative story where you uncovered something and you're like, wow?
Yeah. I did an investigative biography of the Reverend Billy Graham, and another reporter and I looked into his finances. And he hadn't done anything scandalous, of course, but he had tucked away $23 million to eventually someday build a Bible conference center. And we released that information to the public, and it went around the world because he hadn't let his donors know. And he was very embarrassed about that, and eventually started a financial disclosure network for evangelists that exists to this day.
Wow, that's interesting. So before we get to the Pulitzer and the 3 Mile Island story, let's back up to you getting ready to travel around the world, and you need to get a passport.
Yes.
And no birth certificate, and your life's about to turn upside down.
So I'm staying with my parents on the farm, that farm in Keswick, at our tenant house, and I realized I need this birth certificate, and I drove to Richmond to get a copy of it. And on the way back to Keswick, about an hour's drive, I happened to read that birth certificate, and in it, it says, it's sort of a questionnaire. When I was born in 1945, the birth certificate was something the mother filled out. And it said how many other children of this mother are now living. And she had put the numeral 1. And I thought, that's odd. I knew that she'd had a miscarriage, and maybe she was somehow confused about the question. So I went to her that evening when she was cooking at the kitchen stove and asked, why did you put this 1 here? And that's when she said, you know who that is? And I said,
just
no.
Nonchalant and without any emotion.
Yeah, right. Just very relaxed. No, I don't know who that is. What are you talking about? She said, that's Ronnie. And Ronnie was the boy, 10 years older, they said was my cousin.
That was kind of in and out of your life on the farm, and there was never any inclination from you that Ronnie was a half-brother.
No, I had no idea.
So at that moment, does your mind start racing back to those interactions with Ronnie and maybe how you were treated and how Ronnie was treated? What was that like? I
was already thinking about that night, and of course I flew away to Europe soon after, but I was thinking all the time about that boy. I knew that he had it hard, and I had it so good. I was really treated royally. And I knew that there was a tremendous contrast between our two childhoods.
That pain is tough.
Yes.
That guilt is tough. And to try to reconcile that when you're away. When you came home, is that when the investigative journalist part just kind of kicked in and you thought, I've got to find out, I've got to find out?
I did. I knew that I needed to know him. And I was a little reluctant because I had it so much better than he did. Why would he want to be a brother to me at this late stage?
Well, and at the time, so he had spent years, like you had said, in the foster care system, in the orphanage, and then in the mental hospital, because there was nowhere to put teens at that time.
Yes.
So all that's playing into his developmental process also.
Yes. Yeah, he was in and out of institutions, unfortunately, because there weren't very many places for wards of the state, unwanted children like him.
So in your book, you so tenderly not only describe him, but you also you treat your mother with a gentleness and a respect. Even though I know that those emotions flooding through, I can only imagine the hundreds of questions that you had for her, and wondering why, as you say, you were treated so royally and he was on the outskirts. How did you come to terms with that in order to step back and dig into your story so that you could find the truth?
Yeah, I had to be very careful. I didn't want to hurt her, but I had, as you say, just hundreds of questions about how this came to be and why this mother who was so good to me, who would do anything in the world for me, had somehow let go of Ronnie. So I kept going back to her, and I would collect little bits of the story from time to time. But it really wasn't until very late in her life that I really got to know Ronnie, for one thing, and then had a lot more questions to ask her.
And I read that you were obviously glad that they were both collectors and didn't throw things away, so you actually could go back and find pieces of information on him, on her, on Ronnie's father, that I guess you uncovered the name, but you still don't know who that was, and you've kept that private in the book too.
Yeah.
So let's jump ahead to the fact that sometimes we think we know what's going on in our own backyard, and we really don't, because here, living pretty close to you at the barber shop in Vinton, is this man who's your half brother.
Yes. And I was still kind of reluctant to go find him, thinking he might rebuff me. But I walked in one day in 1987. I walked into his barber shop in Vinton, right on the main drag, Pollard Street. And he looked at me and didn't recognize me right away. And I told him I'm Mary Carter. And that right then we began a siblinghood finally. And I got to know him then and kept going back to the barber shop.
And his story ended in a way a little tragically too, because he was going to continue for life to throw him a curveball in a way that he ended up suffering from, a very rare disease that, again, if he would have been in a family, right, and someone may have noticed, then it may not have progressed where it went.
That's what was so outrageous about this story. That of all the people in the world, and this disorder he had strikes only 40 people in a million, that he happened to get this disfiguring disease called acromegaly that transformed him and warped his face and his internal organs, and his hands and feet were still growing when he was 55 years old. And that illness played into all of his lack of knowledge about his own family, who his father was, what his father looked like. And so that this happened to him, I could not believe how unjust this was.
Well, your compassion and your love for him, that you stepped up after all of these years, you stepped up and you stepped in and you took care of him and you helped him. Would you be willing to read some for us?
Yes, I'd love to.
and set up the section that you've chosen.
I'm writing about, at this point I'm writing about the day he died in 1995. And I was out of town. The morning I got the call that he was gone, I drove in from out of town. I tore down the interstate as if a magnet in my blood were pulling me back to Ronnie. At his 2 rented rooms, his heaps of stockpiled clothes, guns, cash, and food testified to his reclusive life. He'd always been ready for a quick getaway. I'd stopped by to grab his prized camel-colored suede coat, along with a favorite shirt, tie, and fresh khakis for the undertakers. I picked a pair of size 14 shoes from a mound of them. At 55, his feet were still growing. Ronnie's death certificate listed the cause of death as a heart arrhythmia brought on by a rare disfiguring disease. More than anything, however, Ronnie's distrust of people killed him. Once he'd been a sweet-faced little boy with soft gray eyes and white blonde hair. Pictures show him giggling as a baby and up to the 1st grade, beaming like a handsome prince. Then his circumstances took an awful dive. Ronnie lost his base of support. He was thrown from one institution to another. In early adulthood, he won his freedom and achieved some small-town dignity. He made friends and had some fun. Then biology would take its turn clobbering him. Old driver's license photos reveal that in his 20s, a glandular disorder began transforming his face, hands, feet, heart, larynx, airways, gut, all his insides. Over decades, it turned him into the freak he always thought himself to be. He avoided stares by getting his food at drive-thrus. He thought he was just turning old and ugly earlier than most people. Maybe he looked like his father, he said, whoever his father was. It occurred so incrementally that it would be decades before anyone on his short list of friends realized something medically terrible had been happening to Ronnie. They'd witnessed it, yet they hadn't understood what they were seeing. His girlfriends drifted away as he became sicker and stranger looking, and I came back into his life too late to make much of a difference. No one, not his doctor, not his dentist, not the men who sat in his chair for their flat tops and their high-and-tights, not a soul had sounded an alarm insistent enough to help Ronnie save himself.
And when you think about the fact that we just walk by people sometimes, don't we? And we don't know what's happening. And you've spent so much time, not only you made his life so much better and reconcile that for you. How do you deal with the pain of everything that's happened? You know, I'm sure that there's a support network that's been really helpful, but how do you get past that and move on?
Well, writing this book really was my best therapy, and doing it and pulling all the strands of the story together. It helped me understand what was going on for my mother and for Ronnie over all those years, because the story really covers about a century of shame and all sorts of troubles for both of them. And so writing it, I think, was the best thing I could do. I still deal with some feeling that I have exposed my mother, and maybe I had asked her if I could write his story, and she did say I could. She said, wait until I'm gone and then you can do it. But I still sometimes feel a little uneasy about having done it. But I think it is helpful for people to read about another person's story. I'm getting cards and letters now from people saying they're reaching out to an estranged brother or sister, and they're rethinking the difficulties of their parents' life. And so it makes me think that maybe this is a story that did need to be told.
And maybe that's the message, right? And maybe that's the gift for everyone who picks up your book, as a way to see a glimmer of themselves or someone they know in order to find a way to make a difference.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've never written a book before, so
what a way to start.
Yes. And different people are attracted to different themes and different aspects of the book. And that's really wonderful, because I can see it does kind of help them think through their own stories.
Well, sure, because if we look at your earlier work, by winning a Pulitzer on an investigative journalist team for 3 Mile Island, this is raw, and you're vulnerable, and you put your family and your story on the pages for everyone to look at. Do you have any mementos or things that you saved from Ronnie's?
Oh, I have many things. I still trim my husband Dan's beard with Ronnie's barber shears, and I still have Ronnie's flashlight that I call Sparkle In from the yard with every evening. And I have a lot of things that belong to him, and our mother and my father too.
Well, and the best thing you have is what's right here in your heart, right?
That's right.
By making a difference. This has been a delight talking to you, learning about your story. Thank you so much for sharing it, and thank you so much for wanting the world to know about it, and maybe for us to address some of our own family issues.
Thank you.
Take a look.
Thank you so much, Rose.
It's been a pleasure. Special thanks to Mary Carter Bishop for inviting us to her home here in Roanoke. I'm Rose Martin, and thank you so much for joining us. Tell your friends about us, and I hope to see you next time, right around the corner.
Production funding for Right Around the Corner provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Anne Ray Foundation, and by viewers like you. Thank you.